At the exact moment when Sophie turned to the guests and said, "I also have a secret," George felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. He knew that this day would change their lives forever, but he never imagined it would be like this. What came next left everyone speechless, and that was just the beginning. George Martin parked his discreet sports car a few yards from the small diner that had become his refuge in recent weeks. The place was far from the sophisticated restaurants he usually frequented, but that was precisely the point. Here, he was just another customer, and the waitress who always served him didn't seem to care about his fame or fortune. The aroma of strong coffee and simple food filled the air as George crossed the door. It was a welcome relief after endless meetings with investors and advisors who expected him to assume the presidency of Martin Tech, the technology empire his father had built from scratch. But George, at 28, felt suffocated by the expectations. He never wanted to be the kind of man who existed only to maintain a legacy that wasn't truly his. The bell on the door chimed as he entered, and he soon spotted Sophie Rose behind the counter in her light blue apron. She was busy cleaning a table, and her eyes, as welcoming as the place itself, lit up when she saw him. It wasn't the first time George noticed that sincere sparkle in her gaze, something that touched him deeply. Unlike the people he mingled with in the world of business and gala parties, Sophie didn't seem impressed by his status. She treated him as a human being, not as a name on a Forbes list. "Hello, George," she said, smiling as she walked over to the table he always occupied in the corner. "The usual," George nodded with a slight smile, watching as she moved with efficiency and grace, a stark contrast to the high society women he knew. They were polished, calculating, always concerned with appearances and what others thought. Sophie, on the other hand, was unpretentious. Her smile was genuine, her laughter contagious, and, more importantly, she seemed at peace with what she had, no matter how simple it was. While Sophie prepared the coffee, George leaned back in his chair, looking through the diner's dirty window. The city outside was a whirlwind of movement, people rushing back and forth without stopping to breathe. He, however, felt strangely calm here, as if this small space was a bubble isolating him from the chaos. George knew the main reason was Sophie. She was the opposite of everything he knew, and that fascinated him. In recent months, he had grown accustomed to chatting with her between orders, listening to her stories about a simple life full of challenges. Sophie was 24 and had been raised by a single mother who worked hard to support the family. Despite the difficulties, she always maintained a positive outlook on life. This intrigued George, who, despite all the luxury, felt empty. Money had bought everything except peace of mind. Sophie returned with the coffee, the familiar smell filling the air between them. "Busy day?" she asked, pulling up a chair to sit for a moment, something she only did when business was slow. There was something about Sophie that always made George lower his guard, even when he tried to maintain a neutral posture. He sighed, looking at the cup. "Something like that. I've been in meetings all morning. People are eager for me to take control of the company." Sophie nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on him, an expression of understanding forming on her face. She knew that, for many, inheriting a fortune seemed like the perfect dream, but for George, it felt more like a golden trap. "And you?" George asked, turning the conversation to her, something he always did. Sophie's life seemed much more interesting than the same old corporate problems. "Any news around here?" She shrugged, fiddling with the apron in her hands. "Not much. Same routine, but, I don't mind. I like knowing what to expect. Life is already full of complicated surprises without work being one of them." George laughed softly. That's what he admired about her, her simplicity. Sophie had a perspective on life he had never considered, but was starting to desire. She wasn't worried about what others thought, nor about money, status, or appearance, all that seemed so irrelevant in her universe, and George found himself wanting to be part of that universe, even if temporarily. As the days passed, the time they spent together extended, and George realized that despite all the advice from his friends and family to return to reality, he couldn't stay away from Sophie. She was different from anyone he had ever known, and that made him question everything. But that relationship, as genuine as it was, seemed like a minefield ready to explode at any moment. There was much more between them than Sophie knew, secrets and responsibilities that George couldn't simply ignore. Each time he returned home to the immense Martin mansion, he felt the weight of his mother Vivian's expectations, a woman obsessed with maintaining the family's status and image. It was only a matter of time before reality knocked on the door of that small diner. However, George was willing to ignore that reality a little longer, savoring every conversation, every smile that Sophie offered him. Deep down, he knew he couldn't escape his responsibilities forever. The Martin tech empire was waiting for him, and with it, the pressures that accompanied the name he carried. Sooner or later, he would have to face it, and when that moment came, Sophie would be the first to be affected. The sound of George's footsteps echoed through the empty corridors of the Martin mansion as he walked toward the main hall. The environment was as cold as his mother Vivian's eyes, who awaited him seated on one of the velvet sofas adorning the vast room. The mansion was a monument to his father's success, every corner exuding luxury, every detail meticulously chosen to reflect the family's status. However, for George, that house had never been a real home. It was more like a prison of unattainable expectations. Vivian raised her gaze when he entered, her fingers intertwined on her lap, her face impeccably composed as always. She was a woman of great beauty and presence, known for her absolute control over appearances and the family's business affairs. But behind that elegant face was an implacable coldness that George knew very well. He knew she was aware of his relationship with Sophie, and as always, she wouldn't miss the opportunity to express her discontent. "George," she began, in a polite but clearly reproachful tone, "we need to talk." George sighed and sat on the sofa opposite hers. He knew what was coming, but the mental exhaustion after yet another day surrounded by lawyers and shareholders prevented him from contesting in advance. "Mother, if this is about Sophie, Of course it's about her," Vivian interrupted, maintaining a controlled yet sharp tone. "Do you really think I wouldn't find out? A waitress, George, someone who serves food in some diner. This is utterly absurd. We, the Martin family, have responsibilities, and yours is to preserve our family name." George closed his eyes for a brief moment, trying to contain the frustration already bubbling inside him. This was a conversation he had anticipated since he began getting closer to Sophie. He knew his mother would never understand. For Vivian, the world revolved around status, power, and fortune. But for him, these things had never brought true happiness. "You don't know her," he said, opening his eyes and fixing his gaze firmly on his mother. "Sophie is different. She's not interested in my money or my fame, and frankly, that's what attracts me most about her." Vivian let out a short, humorless laugh. "Everyone says that, dear, but the reality is you're letting yourself be deceived by a woman with no future. She will bring scandals, gossip. She'll tarnish our name. Is that what you want? A relationship based on something so ordinary?" George leaned forward, his tone finally revealing his irritation. "What I want, Mother, is something real. And you don't understand that because everything in your life is about maintaining a facade. I'm not asking for your approval because I don't need it. What I'm asking is that you respect my decision." Vivian remained silent for a few moments, her eyes meticulously evaluating her son. The tension between them intensified with each passing second. She then stood up elegantly, adjusting the silk dress she wore. When she spoke again, her voice was even colder. "I will not allow you to throw your life away because of a woman who doesn't fit into our family. I've already spoken with your father, and we both agree. If you insist on this, you can say goodbye to your place at Martin Tech." She stared at him with a cold gaze. "And to your place in this family." The words hung in the air like a heavy blow, but George, instead of faltering, felt incredibly light. The threat she had used so many times in the past now seemed like a distant echo. For the first time, he realized how much this life had built around expectations and power games really didn't matter as much as he thought. "If that's the price for being happy, then so be it," he said calmly, standing up as well. "I don't need the company, and frankly, Mother, I don't need you either." Vivian remained motionless, shocked by the firmness and disdain in George's tone. Perhaps she expected him to beg for forgiveness or to yield to pressure as he had so many times before. But that didn't happen. Without waiting for a response, George turned and began to leave the room, the weight of the confrontation finally lifting from his shoulders. As he walked away, he felt something new growing inside him, a freedom he had never experienced. For the first time in his life, he wasn't acting to please anyone. He was following his own path, even if it was a path that took him away from the wealth and power his family had accumulated over generations. However, deep down, he knew that this decision would bring consequences. His relationship with Sophie, already fragile due to the social chasm between them, would now be put to the test in ways he hadn't foreseen. George hadn't yet told her about how severe his family's opposition was, nor about the threats now looming over him. As he climbed the grand marble staircase leading to his room, the phone in his pocket vibrated. It was a message from Sophie. "Can we meet tonight? I need to talk to you." George frowned. There was something in the tone of the message that seemed different. It wasn't the usual enthusiasm he received when she suggested a meeting. Something was wrong. He put the cell phone back in his pocket, trying to push away the feeling that things were about to change drastically. Perhaps the confrontation with his mother was just the beginning of a series of twists he couldn't predict. As soon as he entered his room, he gazed at the large mirror that decorated the opposite wall. The reflection of a young man impeccably dressed in a tailored suit stared back at him. He was perfectly presentable, as always, but inside he felt like a stranger. That wasn't him. Sophie knew him better than anyone. She knew who he really was, or so George believed. After all, what could go wrong? The muffled sound of voices echoed across the vast lakeside property where George and Sophie's wedding was about to take place. The event, which was supposed to be intimate and reserved, had turned into a high society spectacle, a true display of power and wealth. George knew this wasn't what Sophie had envisioned, but he was determined to ignore the chaos around him. All that mattered that day was that he and Sophie would finally be together. Guests were scattered throughout the perfectly decorated gardens, their fine clothes contrasting with the simplicity of Sophie's dress. As George walked down the improvised aisle between the white chairs, he felt the weight of disapproving gazes upon him, especially those of his mother, Vivian, who sat in the front row with a cold, impenetrable expression. He positioned himself before the altar, trying to stay calm as the murmur around him grew. Soft string music filled the air, and then, as if time had stopped, Sophie appeared. She was stunning, but not in the way most present would expect. Her dress was simple, without the glitz and extravagance that usually adorned brides of the elite. The white fabric flowed elegantly, highlighting her figure without ostentation, a choice that perfectly reflected who she was. Unlike the brides Vivian would imagine for George, Sophie was real, authentic, and that was evident in every detail. George's eyes fixed on her as she walked slowly down the aisle, a light smile on her face, but her eyes revealing a mix of nervousness and determination. He knew that moment wasn't easy for her. The silent judgment of everyone around weighed on her shoulders, but even so, Sophie held her head high. George felt proud of her for that, and also a growing fear that, somehow, everything might crumble. When Sophie finally reached the altar, the two of them looked at each other for a moment, a silent exchange of understanding and support. George took her hand, feeling the firmness of her grip. The sound of voices around them diminished to a distant whisper as the officiant began the ceremony. It was as if the entire world disappeared, leaving only the two of them. However, as the ceremony progressed, George noticed something strange in Sophie's behavior. She seemed distracted, almost distant, as if her mind were elsewhere. When it came time for the vows, her hesitation was clear. Sophie took a small step forward, took a deep breath and looked at the audience. A surprising gesture that captured everyone's attention. She began, her voice faltering but soon steadying. "Before we continue, there's something I need to say. Something I've never shared with anyone here, not even you, George." George frowned, feeling a chill run down his spine. The sudden change in Sophie's tone made his heart race. All the guests' eyes were fixed on her, and the nervous murmur that ran through the crowd began to grow. He squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to continue. "My real name isn't Sophie Rose," she said, her voice now firmer, echoing through the silent garden. "And I'm not the woman you all think I am." Shock spread across the guests' faces, and George stood paralyzed, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't understand what was happening. The woman beside him, the one he'd fought for against all odds, was revealing something he never expected. Sophie took another step forward, her eyes fixed on the crowd before her, ignoring the growing murmur. "I grew up in one of the wealthiest families in this country," she continued, the words flowing with surprising calm. "My father is one of the biggest real estate tycoons, but at 18 I ran away. I ran because I was tired of that world, tired of living under expectations, of being judged by my last name, by my family's wealth. I wanted to know what real life was like. I wanted to feel what it was to be myself without the weight of a name." She paused, her breathing accelerated. The silence around was total. Everyone awaited her next words with a mix of shock and curiosity. Georgia, however, remained silent, trying to process the bombshell revelation he'd just heard. "I worked as a waitress, not because I had to, but because I wanted to understand the value of work. I wanted to feel connected to the world in a way I never could in my previous environment. And that's how I met you, George." She finally turned to him, her eyes filled with deep emotion. "I knew that if you knew who I really was, you might see me as just another one of those people, one of those artificial and empty figures driven only by money. So I hid the truth, but I can't do that anymore." George remained motionless, not knowing how to react. He looked at Sophie and, for the first time, realized how much she had hidden of herself to be by his side. It wasn't just the fact that she was rich, it was what that represented. The escape from a world they were both trying to leave behind, but that somehow still pursued them. "I love you, George," said Sophie, her voice trembling, "but I can't start our life together with a lie. My name is Sophie Archer, and if you still want to marry me, now you know who I really am." The guests began to whisper, the atmosphere becoming dense and charged with tension. George could feel his mother's gaze burning into his skin, perhaps expecting him to step back, to let himself be consumed by wounded pride, by the unexpected betrayal. But contrary to everyone's expectations, George felt profound relief. Sophie was exactly who he imagined. Someone real, someone fighting against the same emptiness he felt. "I always knew there was something special about you," George finally said, breaking the silence. "And now that I know who you really are, nothing has changed. I love you, Sophie. Or Sophie, it doesn't matter the name." He smiled slightly, holding her hand even more firmly. "And it's with you that I want to spend the rest of my life, without secrets." The relief in Sophie's eyes was instantaneous. The murmurs subsided, and the ceremony continued, now under a new light, with the truth finally revealed. The wedding was over. The reception, a grand banquet with stunning views of the lake, proceeded as planned, but the atmosphere was far from light. Sophie's revelation, or rather Sophie Archer's, had created an invisible fissure in the environment, where whispers and sly glances replaced laughter and cheerful conversations. Even so, George was at peace. He knew that the truth, as hard as it was, would unite them in a more authentic way. George watched Sophie from a distance as she spoke with some guests who approached, hesitant but curious to know more about the bride's true identity. He could see the sparkle in her eyes, mixed with slight tension. The revelation had been liberating, but had also left Sophie vulnerable, exposed to the judgment of that elitist circle. It wasn't long before Vivian Martin, his mother, approached. Her demeanor was as firm as ever, but there was an intensity in her eyes that George knew all too well. He knew that a confrontation with her was inevitable, and now, with Sophie's revelation, that moment seemed to be approaching rapidly. "George," Vivian began in a low and severe tone as she approached him, "I need to speak with you." He sighed, already anticipating what would come next, and followed his mother to a more secluded area of the property, where the music and chatter of the party became mere distant echoes. "What do you think you're doing?" Vivian fired as soon as they were out of earshot. Her eyes sparkled with restrained anger. "I warned you that this woman wasn't what she seemed, but even I didn't expect such a monumental lie." "It wasn't a lie," George retorted, his voice calm but firm. "She didn't tell everything, it's true, but she did it for reasons I understand." Vivian shook her head with an ironic smile, as if she couldn't believe her son was defending Sophie after everything that had happened. "Yet, do you really think you can trust someone who hides such an important part of who she is?" Vivian's voice was sharp, each word carrying an implicit accusation. A woman who ran away from her own wealthy family and chose to live as a waitress. For what? To prove a point. This behavior is irrational and irresponsible, George. And you, my son, are letting yourself be dragged into a life that isn't yours. George clenched his fists, fighting the growing frustration. He knew that to his mother, none of this made sense. She was so immersed in social conventions and the expectations that had shaped her own life that she couldn't see beyond them. To Vivian, everything was a matter of status and control. "Mother, for the first time in my life, I feel like I've found someone who understands what I'm going through. She doesn't love me for my money, and that's something you'll never understand. It's not about her name or her family's fortune. It's about who she is, and that's the person I've chosen to be with." Vivian stared at him with calculated coldness, as if deciding what her next move would be. "George, this woman, Sophie, whatever she wants to call herself, is ruining your life. And if you continue with this, you're going to end up losing everything," she threatened, her voice lower now, but full of venom. He laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, without humor. "Lose what, Mother? A company I never wanted. A name that weighs like an anchor around my neck. If that's what you think I'll lose, then you don't really know me. And I'm tired of living up to your expectations." Vivian's expression hardened even more, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned and walked back to the party, leaving George alone with his thoughts. The weight of the conversation with his mother still hung over him when George decided to step away from the hustle of the party for a few moments. He walked to a small hill near the lake, where the property's lights seemed distant and the waters reflected the starry sky. He felt a strange mixture of tranquility and apprehension. Although he was confident in his love for Sophie, he couldn't ignore the fact that the revelation had brought up issues he hadn't fully considered. Sophie found him there shortly after. Her steps were light, but George heard her before she arrived. She approached silently, stopping beside him as she looked out over the lake. The soft wind lightly tousled her hair, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "So, I imagine things got a bit complicated," she said, breaking the silence. George let out a short laugh, but this time there was tenderness in his voice. "Complicated is an understatement," he replied, turning to face her. "But none of this changes how I feel about you. It just caught me by surprise, you know. But I understand why you did what you did." Sophie sighed, and George saw the weight of guilt in her eyes. She sat on the grass, and he joined her, both looking up at the dark sky above them. "I was scared, George." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "And afraid that if you knew, you'd see me like everyone else did before. A rich girl who never had to fight for anything, who never knew what it was to really work. I ran away from my family because I wanted to be different, wanted something real. And when I met you, I didn't want that part of my past to push you away from me." George looked at her, feeling the vulnerability in her words. He knew exactly what she meant because he felt the same way. Both had been shaped by expectations they hadn't asked for, and, in different ways, were struggling to escape them. "You've given me more than I could ever hope for, Sophie." He used the name she had adopted as a reminder that, to him, her essence was what mattered, not the fortune or the surname. "I love you for who you are, and not for what you left behind. That will never change." Sophie smiled at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "I love you, George. I've always loved you." They remained there for a long time in silence, with the gentle sound of the water and the night wind around them. There, in the tranquility between the stars and the lake's reflection, fears and insecurities seemed small. What mattered was that they had chosen each other, against all odds, and were willing to face whatever came together. But even in that moment of serenity, George knew that the battle was far from over. The days following the wedding were not easy. George and Sophie had decided to temporarily distance themselves from the social circle surrounding the Martin family, seeking refuge where they could breathe and reflect on their next steps. But the world around them seemed determined not to give them rest. The tabloids were quick to feed on Sophie's bombshell revelation, turning her past into a media circus. Articles insinuated that she had deceived George, that her escape from the Archer family fortune was a strategy to attract media attention, and, of course, the heir of another billionaire empire. To George, all of this was the perfect reflection of what he hated about the world he was born into. Money and power were never detached from scandals and manipulations. That morning, George woke up with a slight headache and a growing discomfort. He looked to the side, but the bed was empty. Sophie wasn't there. He got up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and found her sitting on the porch of the country house where they were staying, her back to him, looking at the horizon. As he approached, he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped the coffee mug tightly. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, approaching and sitting next to her. Sophie turned, a tired smile appearing on her face, but he could see the internal struggle in her eyes. "No," she shrugged, letting out a long sigh. "I think I'm getting used to waking up worried. All this exposure. It feels like I'm back where I ran away from." George looked at her, feeling a pang of guilt. He knew that by marrying him, Sophie had re-entered the world she had tried so hard to avoid. There was no longer any escape from public scrutiny, malicious gossip, or constant speculations about her intentions. "I'm sorry about that," he said in a low voice. "If I could take you out of this mess, I would." Sophie shook her head, leaning in to rest her head on his shoulder. "It's not your fault, George. I knew this moment would come. I just didn't imagine it would be so suffocating." The truth was that, as much as they had tried to build a protective bubble around their relationship, the outside world was always lurking, ready to invade. Even in that country house, far from luxuries and the big city, the headlines continued to chase them. A phone call interrupted the silence between them. George looked at his cell phone, hesitant. It was his mother, Vivian. He knew he needed to answer, but feared what would come next. His last interactions with her had been tense, and he imagined that after the wedding, the distance had only deepened. "I need to take this," he said, getting up and moving a few steps away before finally answering the call. "George," began Vivian, her voice polished but distant, "we need to talk about your position in the company." George closed his eyes for a moment. He knew this conversation would come eventually, but hoped to buy more time. He was ready to fight for Sophie, but that didn't mean he was prepared to lose everything at once. "I know you've been reluctant to take control," Vivian continued, "but with recent events, the directors are worried. The public exposure of your relationship with Sophie, well, it's affecting the company's image. They are demanding a decision." "I don't care what the directors think, Mother," he said, firmer than he expected. "The company has always cared more about appearances than about what's right. If they can't accept my decision to be with Sophie, maybe it's better I really step away." "George, don't be foolish. You're talking about abdicating your legacy. Are you willing to throw away everything your family has worked for?" He looked at the horizon, his mother's words weighing on his thoughts. Part of him knew she was right. Martin Tech was more than a company. It was the essence of the Martin family, the symbol of everything his father had built. But at the same time, this inheritance had been the burden he carried since he could remember. It was a responsibility he had never chosen, but had always been imposed upon him. "I'll think about it," he said, ending the call before his mother could continue. Returning to where Sophie was, he saw in her eyes that she knew something was wrong. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but carried the weight of all the uncertainties hovering over their future. "Was that your mother?" Sophie asked cautiously. "It was," George sighed, sitting next to her. "The company is pressuring me. They're not handling all this very well." "All this?" Sophie frowned, the pain clear in her eyes. "You mean me?" George shook his head quickly. "No, that's not what I meant." He took her hand, holding it firmly. "I'm trying to protect you, Sophie, but things are getting more complicated. The company, my family, they're all expecting me to do something, but I don't want to play this game anymore." Sophie looked at him sadly. I don't want you to have to choose between me and your family, George. That was never my intention. He gazed at her, his heart tightening at how much the situation was affecting her. I'm not choosing between you and my family, he said. I'm choosing the life I want to live, the life we can have together. But that means giving up some things, and I'm okay with that. What worries me is how you're handling all this. Sophie averted her gaze, as if his words had hit her unexpectedly. She had always been strong, always resisted the pressure of a complicated life. But now, with her entire past revealed and the world around her falling apart, George began to wonder if the price they were both paying was too high. He pulled her closer, wrapping her in his arms as if he could protect her from the world. We'll get through this, he murmured. But for the first time, a small part of him wasn't so sure. The following days were marked by tense silence between George and Sophie, as if both were trying to process the whirlwind their lives had become. Sophie seemed increasingly introspective, as if weighing every word and action. George, in turn, felt powerless against the growing pressure from his family and the company, not to mention the feeling that Sophie was slowly drifting away. One evening, as the moon shone brightly over the lake, Sophie asked to talk to George. They were on the porch, and the cool night breeze seemed to carry the unspoken tension between them. Sophie was restless, her eyes fixed on the calm waters. George, she began, her voice soft but laden with a seriousness he had rarely heard. I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, and what it means for us. He turned to her, his heart beating faster. He already sensed that this conversation wouldn't bring good news. What do you mean? He asked, trying to stay calm. Sophie sighed deeply, still avoiding his gaze. When I ran away from my family, I was seeking freedom, a way to live a life that was mine, without expectations, without judgments. And when I met you, I thought it could be different with you, that we could build something away from this world. She paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. But now, I'm realizing that by marrying you, I ended up returning to the same place I tried to escape from. George felt a tightness in his chest, as if her words were a punch to the gut. I know things are hard, but this is temporary, he began, desperately trying to find a solution. We can overcome this. We can create our own life, away from all this mess. Sophie finally looked at him, and her eyes were full of sadness. George, I love you. I will always love you. But the weight of this life, I don't know if I can carry it again. I ran away because I wanted to live simply, to reconnect with myself, and now all I feel is that I'm trapped again, only this time with you, and it destroys me. Her words hit him hard. George knew Sophie was suffering but hadn't realized how suffocated she felt. He loved her more than anything, but at that moment, he realized that perhaps his love wasn't enough to dispel the pain she was facing. So what are you saying? He asked, his voice trembling, unable to disguise the fear of what was coming next. Sophie wiped away a tear rolling down her face and took a deep breath before speaking. I'm saying I need some time. I need space to find myself again, to understand if I can handle this life by your side, or if I need to return to who I was. She paused, the silence between them almost unbearable. I'm not saying it's over, but I need distance to discover what I want. George remained silent, trying to digest what he had just heard. He wanted to fight, to convince her that they could solve everything together, but part of him knew that Sophie needed this time. He couldn't force her to stay. Their love, as strong as it was, couldn't survive if Sophie continued to feel suffocated. If that's what you need, I understand, he said, his voice choked, but I'll be here waiting for you. I'll never stop loving you, Sophie. Never. Sophie gave him a sad smile, and he saw that his words affected her, but the look in her eyes showed she was firm in her decision. They remained silent for a long time, just watching the lake, each lost in their own thoughts. The next morning, Sophie left. She didn't leave forever, but made it clear that she needed time away to reconnect with her essence. George watched as she walked away, feeling a mix of pain and acceptance. He knew that this separation was necessary, even if it meant losing the woman he loved. Without Sophie, George returned to a life that felt empty. The Martin mansion, with all its luxury, seemed more like a museum of memories of who he used to be. He began to distance himself more from the company, refusing to attend meetings and delegating responsibilities to other directors, a move not well received by his mother, Vivian. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The media speculated about the separation, while the Martin family continued to pressure him to make decisions about his future in the company. But deep down, George knew his priority was one thing: to wait for Sophie, hoping she would find what she was looking for and return to him. Then one day, while he was at his country house, far from everything, George received a letter. It was from Sophie. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope, and he felt his heart race upon seeing her handwriting. The words in the letter were simple, but full of emotion. "George, I've spent these months reflecting on everything we've lived and what we've built together. It wasn't an easy decision to step away, but I needed to discover who I was outside the chaos, outside the expectations, outside what the world expected of us. I've learned a lot about myself during this time, and as much as life by your side was full of challenges, it was also the time I felt most alive. I felt love in its purest form. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I know I can't keep running from who I am or from who we are together. I'm coming back to you, if you'll still have me. I want to try again, without reservations, without secrets. I love you, Sophie." George felt immense relief wash over him. Tears welled in his eyes, but this time they weren't of sadness. He knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges, but he was willing to face them with Sophie by his side. Sophie was coming back, and with her, the hope that this time they could finally build the life they so desired. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us through the thanks button. Until next time.